Let's begin looking at the 7 sections of the CFAA. You can see through the 7 sections here, section A1 to section A7. Hacking to commit espionage, hacking to obtain information, hacking a federal government computer, hacking to commit fraud, hacking to commit damage, trafficking in passwords, and threats of hacking. If you think back over to what I said earlier in the unit, the focus of the legislators when they were developing the CFAA was to prevent hacking on financial institutions and government computers. And you could see that reflected in the different sections of the CFAA. However, you'll see also that certain sections are applied more broadly when they're looked at in certain types of crimes. Hacking to commit espionage, section A1. This prohibits an individual from knowingly accessing a computer without authorization or exceeding authorized access, and obtaining classified information, and then willfully communicating, delivering, transmitting, or causing the communication, delivery, or transmission to another person who is not authorized to receive that information. So in other words, I take information and give it to somebody or transmit it to somebody who's not authorized to receive that information. The statute also covers willful retention of data and failure to deliver to an employer who's entitled to receive it. This only applies if the individual has reason to believe that the information could injure the United States to the advantage of another nation. It's rare that we see prosecution under Section A1. Generally, we'll see prosecutions under the Espionage Act, which we'll talk about a little later in the course. There are violations, the violations for this offense are felonies with up to 10 years in prison and a fine, and it's 20 years if it's the second or succeeding violations. Hacking to obtain information, section A2, prohibits individuals from intentionally accessing computers without authorization or in excess of authorization, and obtaining information contained in a financial report of a financial institution, a card issuer, or a consumer reporting agency, or the information from any federal government, department, or agency, and information from any protected computer. Protected computer, as it was originally designed, was any computer used by any financial institution or a federal government used in or affecting interstate or foreign commerce. And we'll see how that term of protected computer was actually applied more broadly. So it's easy to show that a computer is used in interstate or foreign commerce because you just see what its use is. So Section A2 is used very frequently, and this is one of the most commonly used sections of the CFAA. A very broad interpretation of protected computer is now being used. And the term obtaining information is also very broadly applied. It includes mere observation of data and does not require actual removal of the data. Now, what I think of when I think of this particular statute, if it is, say, a computer service representative working in a center and has a viewing of a screen that has, say, credit card data and names and addresses and very confidential data about the users on the screen, writes down that information and sticks it into their pocket. Now, they viewed the data. They didn't physically remove it from the system. They were authorized to have access to the system, but what they did with that authorization exceeded their authorization. So therefore, again, this brings up that vision in my mind as an example of violating Section A2. The most significant barrier to a charge or claim under A2 is that the requirement of the act of obtaining is intentional as opposed to mistaken, inadvertent, or careless acts. And if you think back to my example with the service representative, certainly viewing the data, writing it down in contrapoint to the policy of the company, certainly would mean it was intentional, and writing it down and putting it into their pocket certainly would not be inadvertent. Felonies and misdemeanors could be charged in this crime. So if it's a felony, it's a fine and up to 1 year in jail. I'm sorry, a misdemeanor, it's a fine and up to 1 year in jail. A felony is a fine and up to 5 years in prison. For the felony to be applied, the offense has to have been committed for commercial advantage or private financial gain, and the offense was committed in furtherance of any criminal or tortious act or violating the U.S. Constitution or any federal or state law. Again, going back to my example with the service representative, that means sticking it in my pocket is one thing, and I've certainly violated the company policy. But once I commit a fraud with that, now Section A2 applies to because now a crime has been committed. Section A3 prohibits individuals from intentionally accessing non-public federal government computers without authorizations. So these are computers that are exclusively for the use of the government, and computers used by the government to conduct affects the use by or for the government. Now, there's a little confusion here between A2 and A3. So A2 explicitly prohibits certain hacks of federal government computers. Section A3 differs in it prohibits the mere act of intentionally accessing a federal government computer without authorization. So Section A3 is not relevant if data is obtained, because that's probably covered under A2. Section A2 requires both access without authorization and exceeding authorized access. Section A3 requires only intentional access without authorization. Section A3 applies to non-public government computers, so the website of, say, a government computer is not not covered under A3 because it's publicly viewable and accessible. A first-time offense under A3 is a misdemeanor. First-time offense under A2 is a felony. Thus, if applicable, prosecutors will charge under A2 rather than A3. Hacking to commit fraud. Section A4 prohibits individuals from knowingly and with intent to defraud accessing a protected computer without authorization or exceeding authorization and furthering the intended fraud and obtaining anything of value. It does not apply if the object of the fraud was just use of the computer and the value of the use is less than $5,000 during any 1 year period. So what comes to mind in this case is somebody who gains access to a computer for Bitcoin mining and simply does that. They're looking for computer time, they're looking for CPU activity, they're not looking to take any information. This is sort of similar to mail fraud and wire fraud statutes, and it's meant to capture fraud conducted over a computer.